I actually think that they had the right idea by appointing Christoph Freund and Max Eberl, because Christoph Freund in particular with RB Salzburg had a clear transfer strategy, right? That was to find the best players in the world before they were known to be the best players in the world. And in fairness, Bayern Munich did the same thing. That team that won the Champions League, a lot of these younger players. I mean, Kingsley Coman, they picked up from we mentioned this earlier this week. They picked up from Juventus for next to nothing, right? Serge Gnabry, they found in Arsenal's youth academy. They then loaned him out to Werder Bremen and Hoffenheim, and then he became a really effective player for them. He did help them win the Champions League. I mean, his time is probably up now, but it was a very good idea at the time. You then supplemented that with players from your own academy, your Thomas Müllers, etc. But they often found players that were sort of on the verge of becoming something good, but still had flaws. Going further back, Jerome Boateng is another example who they picked up from Man City before he became a German national team player and won the World Cup. And there was a lot of flaws in his games. I remember seeing him in 2012, and I'm like, dear God, what's this? Right? Like, he's not a good player. He was playing left back for Bayern Munich at the time, and he was so many flaws in his passes. And then 2 years later, he was one of the best defenders in the world and won the World Cup. And that is sort of what they were known for doing really well. And then at some point and this was under probably the early years under Hasan Salihamidzic and Oliver Kahn, they started to pursue this idea of signing big names. Whether it was Sadio Mane or, like they brought in, again, at the time it made sense, and I think it cost them long term, but at the time it makes sense. Like when they started bringing in James Rodriguez and Philip Coutinho and, like these guys who became useful role players, and they came in on loan, so it didn't hurt them necessarily long term, but it set these expectations, didn't it? And I, as you were saying, like what does Bayern Munich's financial strategy need to be? Well, Stuttgart signed Finn Jelch from Nuremberg, for example, right? And we all see it. You can see it. Like if I have eyes in your heads, you know that Finn Jelch in 2 or 3 years is going to be one of the best defenders in the world. He's 18, but you can see it. He walked straight from the second division into into a Bundesliga team that plays a very difficult system, and he made that team better. And you wonder, it's like that would have been a player for Nuremberg who played in the second division with that sort of obvious talent would have driven straight to Säbener Straße and signed a 5-year contract, right, if Hoeneß was still in charge.
Yeah.
And that is maybe where they have to get the best young players in Germany signed for Bayern Munich before they were the best players. There's actually one player in the squad right now who fits that perfectly. That's Joshua Kimmich. They signed Joshua Kimmich because of a season he played in the second division with Leipzig. All right. And I think that is what's sort of missing, is this pursuit of them signing ready-made world-class players is not the foundation of what the greatness of the club was built on originally. They signed players that had world-class potential and became world-class at Bayern Munich. And that includes Frank Ribéry and Arjen Robben, who were extremely flawed players before they arrived in Munich. And I think that is sort of what they need to go back to. And they can't 100% emulate what PSG have done, but they can stop trying spending a lot of money on single players. Like they did for Harry Kane, right? That's a lot of money for one player. That could have been 3 or 4 guys, right? Like Kvaratskhelia, who was a decisive player for PSG winning the Champions League. Remember, PSG were like one match out of like crashing out of the Champions League. Then in January, they signed Kvaratskhelia, and he completely turned around that club's fortune in the second half of the season. He was available for 70 million euros. That is one Florian Wirtz leg.
And and that in itself is probably worth bearing in mind. We talked about Desiree Douay and how, I mean, I think you did. We talked about it before the show. I can't remember if we started recording, but we talked about how Bayern Munich were in for him and then they opted to not sign him, obviously. And you could make the exact same case for, Kvaratskhelia in the sense that he's exactly what Bayern were crying out for in January. you know? And why didn't they go out and sign something like that? And the reason why is A, they already had a number of players in those positions, big earners, who they haven't found a way to move on yet. Obviously, Leroy Sané's potentially moving on. We think he'll probably end up staying, but okay, fine. In theory, he might move on. Serge Gnabry, they don't know what to do with him. Kingsley Coman, they're hoping someone in Saudi Arabia will come along and offer money for him, but you never know. And we mentioned Brian Zaragoza at the start of the week on the bonus show, who's been on loan, looks like he'll be sent back on loan, and he'll probably never play for Bayern Munich again. They had
But
these
he
players in the
should.
way.
But he
Yeah, maybe,
should.
yeah, he should, but he won't. There's a difference there, I think, in the sense that obviously PSG, if they're in that situation, would have still made that signing and said, "We'll deal with that guy, deal with these guys who aren't playing in the summer,
Mm.
sell them to West Ham or something. It'll be fine. We'll figure it out." Now they can do that because, as you said, PSG don't really have to pay their bills. They don't really have to balance their their spreadsheet or whatever in the accountancy department. And Bayern Munich too. The other one is, as you said, Bayern Munich just don't really have the appetite for going out and spending money in January. It's a typical kind of Bundesliga thing in general. It's changing, obviously, but traditionally speaking, you wouldn't really get clubs going out and spending money in January. But that's because traditionally speaking, Bayern Munich knew what their squad was and had not a pretty settled squad, but they'd done their business in the summer window well before the transfer deadline day. So the idea of having to panic by January was just something that never really seemed to happen. There's no need for it in Bayern. But it's interesting in just the sense that the way these two clubs do. PSG definitely seem to have far more clinical or I don't want to say bravery, but it's something like that, courage maybe, to just go out and sign these guys. Because on the one hand, I'm obviously saying Bayern shouldn't be spending money on star players who cost too much money and become like an albatross around Bayern's neck. And Harry Kane, unfortunately, I think is a good example of that. Palhinha maybe to a lesser extent. But equally, we're now in a world where 70 million euros in a first team player just isn't that much money. It's the going rate for a decent player. We talked about Michael Olise winning, what we thought was the Player of the Year award this year. And we're talking about how much of a bargain 52 million euros is. So if 52 million euros is a bargain, then 70 million euros is probably the going rate for a top class winger these days. So
Yeah.
if Bayern are serious about fixing that left wing position, they have to go spend 70 million euros at some point.
So
And if he was available in January because he wasn't going to sign a new deal with Napoli, then Bayern should have been sitting there competing with PSG for his signature. And they weren't. And like there's a number, like I said, there's a number of reasons behind that. They don't want to piss off the players they've got. They don't quite know what's happening with the players they've got.
and Wirtz.
Yeah, and Veth, I suppose, yeah, and they maybe decide we'll put all our eggs in that basket. But even that's an interesting thing in itself. Like, obviously, I'm a huge Wirtz fan, and I think he's a great player, and I think he would have done tremendously well at Bayern. But hoping that they can do everything they can to sign that one big player is exactly the kind of model that PSG have moved away from. It's far more akin to Real Madrid, who, you can maybe argue works well for them in the Champions League, but it hasn't worked well for them this season. And they've got all sorts of problems with Rodrigo and Mbappe and Vinicius Jr. and Bellingham and how they all fit them together. And that's a huge problem that Xabi Alonso's going to have to deal with next season. But I don't envy him in that regard. So it all comes back to who are Bayern Munich trying to emulate in the transfer window? What clubs do they think are doing the job well? And it definitely got the impression under Salihamidzic and Oliver Kahn that they looked at the PSGs and the Real Madrids and thought that's what Bayern Munich should be doing. And it just didn't really work out for them. And hopefully with Freund and Max Eberl, they are kind of taking a more indirect approach to the market and trying to get back that model of outsmarting these other clubs that are happy to spend more money than them. Because I think that's the only way Bayern get ahead in this game. Because, well, I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, we joke about PSG having lots of money, but they've finally got their act together and they've won a Champions League quite comprehensively. And that's what happens when a club gets their act together and stops trying to build these Galacticos teams. And maybe Bayern Munich should figure that out sooner rather than later.